The night they thought they buried me, I was sitting in a hospital bed in Kelowna, watching the snow fall outside the window and making a list. Not a bucket list. Not a prayer list. A list of every single thing my son-in-law had stolen from me and exactly how I was going to take it all back. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually began, on a Tuesday morning in October, the kind of cold, bright morning that makes you grateful you built something worth waking up for. My name is not important. What is important is that I spent 41 years building a chain of hardware and building supply stores across British Columbia and Alberta. 12 locations. From a single rented storefront in Penticton with second-hand shelving and a cash register I bought at an estate sale, to a regional operation that supplied contractors, renovators, and home builders from Kelowna to Red Deer. When I finally sold all 12 locations, the warehouse in Kamloops, the distribution agreement, the brand I walked away with, just under $32 million after taxes. I was 63 years old. My wife, the woman who had stood beside me through every lease negotiation and every slow January and every summer we worked 7 days a week, had passed 4 years earlier from a stroke. Her name was Patricia. She was the kind of woman who remembered every employee's birthday and kept a spare key to the store for whichever young staff member inevitably locked themselves out. I missed her every single day. What I had left was my daughter Claire, and Claire's husband, my son-in-law, a man I will call by what he was, my son-in-law, because he never truly earned anything else from me, and because names hardly matter when the shape of a person is this familiar. My son-in-law had come into our lives about 7 years before the sale. He was charming in the beginning. Confident. He worked in commercial real estate in Vancouver, drove a car that was slightly too expensive for what he claimed to earn, and had a way of leaning forward when he listened to you that made you feel like the most interesting person in the room. Claire was 31 when they met. She was happy. I wanted her to be happy. I told myself that was enough. The first time I noticed something was off. It was small. We were at a family dinner, just the three of us, at my house in West Kelowna, and my son-in-law asked me, very casually, how the sale process was going. I had mentioned the potential sale only once, months earlier, in passing. I had not brought it up again. He had. Just thinking about your future, Dad, he said. He had started calling me Dad around year 2. I had not asked him to. I told him it was moving along. I kept my answer short. He nodded, refilled my wine glass without asking, and changed the subject to something about the Canucks. I watched him for the rest of that evening. The way he guided the conversation, the way he positioned himself between Claire and me without either of them seeming to notice. I filed it away. The sale closed on a Thursday in late September. My lawyer, a woman I had worked with for over 20 years, steady and precise as a good level, handled the closing at her office in downtown Kelowna. I signed the final documents, shook hands with the buyer's representatives, and walked out into the autumn afternoon with a wire transfer confirmation and the strange, hollow feeling that comes when something you built with your hands no longer belongs to you. I called Claire from the parking lot. She was warm, congratulatory, and suggested we all have dinner that weekend to celebrate. My son-in-law was apparently standing right beside her. "Tell him congratulations from me," I heard him say in the background. That weekend dinner was at their home in South Surrey. A large house, newer construction, the kind of open-concept layout Patricia would have found cold. They had decorated it impeccably, though every surface curated, every throw pillow placed with intention. I noticed, when I used the bathroom, that there were renovation magazines stacked on the back of the toilet. Specific ones. The kind that feature multi-million-dollar custom builds. I noticed they were not new. Over dinner, my son-in-law steered the conversation toward my plans. "You've got real capital now," he said, refilling his own glass. "Have you thought seriously about what you want to do with it? Because leaving it sitting in a savings account in this economy would be," he made a small, dismissive gesture. "I've got advisors," I said. Of course. I just mean, there may be opportunities in the commercial space. I know some developers, people who are looking for quiet partners on projects with very strong return profiles. I'll keep that in mind," I said. Claire was watching both of us. She smiled at me, a little apologetically, and I smiled back and let the subject change. Over the following weeks, my son-in-law called more than he had in the previous year combined. Always friendly, always with a reason checking in, passing along an article he thought I'd find interesting, mentioning that someone he knew was doing fascinating things in the Alberta industrial market. Never pushy. Always there. It was my old accountant, a man I'd trusted for 30 years, who first said something directly. We met for coffee one morning in November, and he looked at me across the table and said, "Your son-in-law called my office last week. Asked about your estate structure." I set down my coffee cup. "He said you'd asked him to start gathering information for a review." I did not ask him to do that. My accountant nodded slowly. I thought as much. I drove home that afternoon and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. The mountains were clear across the lake. Patricia used to love that view most in November, when the light went sideways and everything turned copper and gray. I thought about what kind of man builds something for 40 years and then hands it to the wrong person because he was too tired or too lonely or too willing to believe the warmth was real. I thought about my daughter, whether she knew, whether she didn't know, whether the difference even mattered. I called my lawyer that evening. We put a plan in place quietly, over several weeks. Nothing dramatic. No confrontations. I restructured certain accounts. I moved assets into a discretionary trust with my lawyer and my accountant as co-trustees. I reviewed every document my son-in-law had ever asked me to look at or sign. There were 3, and I had each of them examined by a second opinion. One contained a clause that, had I signed it, would have made him a co-signatory on a specific investment account. I had not signed it. I had set it aside, meaning to ask about it later, and forgotten. Or perhaps I had known, somewhere, and had not been ready to look directly at what I was seeing. The week before Christmas, my son-in-law came to visit me alone. Claire was in Vancouver for a work event. He arrived with a bottle of Alberta rye and 2 glasses and sat down in the chair across from me in my living room like a man who had been practicing for this conversation. "I want to talk to you about something honestly," he said. "Father to father, man to man." I said nothing. I let him talk. He had a plan, a development project in the Okanagan, a resort-style residential complex near Peachland. He and 2 partners had secured the land. They needed a lead investor to anchor the financing, someone whose capital and reputation would unlock the construction loan. The minimum investment was $4 million. The projected return, he said, was 18% over 3 years. "I came to you first because family should have first access," he said, "and because I know you understand this region better than anyone." I looked at him for a moment. Then I told him I'd think about it. He poured us both 2 fingers of the rye and lifted his glass. "To you," he said, "and to what you've built." I raised my glass and said nothing. What I did not tell him, what I did not tell anyone yet, was that I had already spoken to a contact of mine, a property developer I had known for 20 years. He knew every major project in the Okanagan Valley. When I described the Peachland development, including the names of the supposed partners, he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "That project fell through 8 months ago. The land was never fully optioned. I don't know who told you about it, but that deal does not exist." The rye was good. I finished my glass, thanked my son-in-law for coming, and walked him to the door. 2 days after Christmas, my daughter called me, upset. There had been an argument. My son-in-law had told her I had agreed to invest in the project and was now backing out, causing problems with his partners. He had apparently already told these partners the capital was committed. "Did you agree?" Claire asked me. Her voice was careful, controlled, the voice she used when she was trying not to show how frightened she was. "I said I would think about it," I said. "That is not an agreement." There was a long pause. "Claire," I said gently, "I need you to hear me when I tell you that there is no project. The land was never secured. The partners he described are not attached to any active development in this region. I had it verified." Another pause. Longer. "He told me you'd say something like that," she said finally, quietly. He told me you were pulling away from the family because you didn't trust him. That was the moment I understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. It was not just financial. He had been working on her perception of me for a long time. Every unanswered call that I'd let go to voicemail. Every dinner I'd left a little early because I was tired. Every time I'd been quiet when he spoke, he had been building a case, brick by brick, in my daughter's mind, that her father was retreating, that her father was suspicious and cold, that her father needed to be managed. I told Claire I loved her. I asked her to please be careful. She said she had to go, and the call ended. I sat with that for 2 days. Then I made the call that changed everything. A former employee of mine, a young man who had worked in my Kelowna store for years before moving into financial compliance work, happened to know someone at the BC Securities Commission. Not officially, not as a referral, just a conversation over coffee, described to me as a hypothetical about what the process would look like if someone had been approaching recently sold business owners with fraudulent investment opportunities. The person on the other end of that hypothetical, I was told, found it very interesting indeed. In the meantime, I did something that took more out of me than I expected. I called my daughter. I asked her to meet me without her husband. She hesitated. She said she would think about it. 3 days later, she called back and asked if she could come for lunch. She arrived looking thin and tired. We sat at the kitchen table with the view of the lake, the same table where her mother had helped her with homework, where we had eaten 1,000 ordinary dinners. I laid out everything I had, not with anger, as clearly and calmly as I could, document by document. The project that didn't exist, the account clause I'd never signed, the call to my accountant he'd made without my knowledge, the timeline of his increased contact following the closing of my sale. Claire did not say anything for a long time. She looked out at the lake. "How long have you known?" she asked. "I had suspicions for some time. Certainty, more recently. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I wasn't sure what you knew. And I needed to be sure before I put you in the middle of it." She turned to look at me then. Her face looked like her mother's face. That particular expression Patricia had when something had broken, and she was deciding whether to grieve it or simply move forward. "I didn't know," she said. "I want you to know that." "I believe you," I said. And I did. What came next unfolded over several months. My son-in-law had apparently approached 4 other individuals in the region with the same or similar investment proposals. 2 of them had transferred funds. The amounts were significant. When investigators began making inquiries, he initially attempted to characterize everything as a misunderstanding, a deal that had simply fallen through, the way deals sometimes do. His story did not hold. My lawyer was present throughout. My accountant provided documentation. The 2 men who had transferred money came forward. My daughter, to her tremendous credit, provided a statement. The proceedings took most of that year. There was a period, in the spring, when my son-in-law attempted to reach me directly, a single voicemail, measured and careful, in which he suggested we could resolve this quietly, and that pursuing it further would damage Claire irreparably. I listened to that message once. Then I forwarded it to my lawyer and deleted it. The outcome was what it was: fraud charges, a conviction, restitution ordered. The other 2 victims recovered the majority of what they had lost. The sentence was 4 years, with eligibility for parole reviewed at the 2-year mark. I did not attend the sentencing. I did not need to be in that room. What I did instead, on the day the verdict came in, was drive out to a spot on the west side of the lake where Patricia and I used to park in the evenings when the kids were young and we needed 20 minutes of quiet. I sat there for a while. The water was very still. A heron stood at the edge of the shore, patient and unbothered, doing exactly what herons do. I thought about the years I spent building something, the early mornings and the slow winters and the staff Christmas parties and the day we opened the 8th location and Patricia cried a little in the parking lot because she hadn't known, when we started, that we would ever get this far. I thought about how a life accumulates, slowly and then all at once, and how the things worth protecting are rarely the things that have a dollar value. Claire filed for divorce that January. She moved back to Kelowna in the spring, into a rental house not far from mine. We had dinner together most Sundays. She was rebuilding herself with the same quiet steadiness I had always admired in her mother, and it made me proud in a way that was almost too large to hold. One Sunday in June, she asked me if I was angry. Still, I thought about that honestly. I was, I said, for a while. But anger is expensive. I've been in business long enough to know you don't carry inventory that costs more than it earns. She laughed at that, a real laugh. The kind she had as a kid, and I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. I had moved a portion of my assets into a foundation that Patricia and I had talked about starting for years, focused on trades, training programs for young people in smaller BC communities. The kind of programs that might have helped a 22-year-old open a small hardware store in a town like Penticton without having to figure out everything the hard way. I hired a director, set the mandate, and stepped back to let people who were better at that kind of work than I was run it properly. There is a particular feeling that comes, I have found, when the thing you built with your hands is finally in the right hands. A quietness, not emptiness. Completion. On a Thursday morning in late October, almost exactly 1 year after the sale had closed, I drove out to the original store in Penticton. The new owners had updated the signage and repainted the exterior a clean dark green. The shelving was the same layout I had designed in 1983. Through the window, I could see a young woman behind the counter explaining something to a customer, patient and knowledgeable, pointing at something in a display case. I sat in my truck for a few minutes. Then I drove home along the lake, past the orchards, and the pull-off where the heron liked to stand, and I thought about what my accountant had said to me once, many years ago, when I was worried about a particular year's numbers and couldn't sleep. He had looked at me over his coffee cup and said, "You can't protect something by holding it too tight. You protect it by building it right." I had not fully understood him then. I understood him now. I turned onto my road, and the mountains were very clear, and the lake was the color it gets in October, deep and serious and going on forever, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, entirely like myself.